Marx begins with an analytical concept and concludes with an implicitly normative position. Even without critically questioning the assumed equilibrium and free market status, he successfully critiques bourgeois political economy by demonstrating the emergence of structural contradictions, class divisions, and inherent exploitation within capitalism. His approach also has important implications for emancipatory praxis by revealing the crisis-prone contradictions in the inner organization of capitalist society, which not only can be taken advantage of but also can serve as a checklist for post-capitalist movements to imagine a future free from these contradictions. Refer to Harvey, 2014. However, Marx accomplishes this at the expense of giving an ideal form to value under capital, which isolates capital from capitalist society and its relationship with nature, an inner versus outer dualism, and excludes other sources of value for their unproductiveness within capitalist production relations. While it is reasonable for Marx to object to the inclusion of unpaid domestic and reproductive work, as well as natural resources, in his definition of value since they do not directly produce exchange value, their indirect contribution to capitalist value production, from production to circulation, only occurs once they are already reified and fetishized. To overcome this self-imposed constraint, we need to invert Marx's value theory by starting from a normative conception of value, and then, on that basis, proceeding toward a transformative analysis. Such a normative value theory is not about normalizing a set of universal value complexes for humanity. Instead, it is to base a theory of reality, inclusive of diverse potentialities and contextual striving for emancipation, on an abstract notion of value. The theory achieves this by liberating the notion of value from the prevailing universalist capitalist mindset and pointing to the most essential, even though potential, sources of value. The universality of normative value is an emergent one, made and remade out of the culmination of endless strivings on the ground to achieve virtues in good lives, rather than a universality imposed by a singular mode of livelihood. See Stavron, 2001. Unlike Harvey, we do not believe this would result in serious shortcomings in our understanding of the so-called inner structure, since a normative notion of value opens the gates for the development of a non-duality theory of capital, that is, the negation of the duality, inner versus outer, that is rooted in the unquestioning of the fetishistic nature of capitalist value. One could inquire as to why we employ the term true value instead of real value. Would the latter term not more closely align with the Marxian concept of real wealth? Marx's term real value may suggest a pragmatic approach to normativity, implying the practical value or usefulness of something in the real world. See Note 5. This aligns well with Marx's view that the value of something is determined by its usefulness or practicality in achieving a particular goal. Although real wealth is not simply an accumulation of use values for Marx, it still lacks the normative element since it refers to the existing productive capacity of society. See Note 6. Therefore, coining real value, based on the notion of real wealth, contradicts our intention of not reducing the theory to a mere concern for use value and existing social capacities as a foundation for normativity. Moreover, while the catchphrase real value of labor can refer to the socially necessary labor time required to reproduce labor power, it is not sufficient to capture the full scope of value in labor. The term true value is used to expand the discussion beyond the logic of capital and to consider labor in its original commoning nature as a human creative power. See Chapter 5 in this book and also Hosseini, 2022b. It implies a critical perspective on the limitations of the capitalist framework and seeks to uncover the underlying reality that is often obscured by ideology and power structures. Therefore, the use of the term true value emphasizes the importance of analyzing labor beyond the narrow framework of capital-labor relations and recognizing its broader social and historical context. See Note 7. Marx's LTV assumes that laborers are paid based on the socially necessary labor time required to reproduce their labor power. However, in many capitalist production relations, labor is not compensated according to its real value. The differentiation between the real value of labor and the value of labor, as variable capital, paid in wage form by capital is crucial, as it contributes to the level of exploitation and surplus value generated by capitalism. It is important to note, however, that this analysis is still limited to the context of the capital-labor relationship under the control of capital. To fully understand the value of labor, we must also consider its true value, which extends beyond the narrow confines of capitalist production. labor is not only shortchanged in terms of its real value, but also in terms of its true value, lost due to its alienation from its commoning nature as a creative power. Therefore, to fully grasp the status of labor in contemporary society, we should expand our analysis beyond the confines of capitalist production, and consider how labor is alienated from its commoning nature as human creative power under capital's extra production relations. For Marx, as well as for mainstream economists, capital functions as an engine of economic growth, historical progress, and advancement. This is a consequence of the particular view of the intrinsic nature of capital, meaning that it must not only be accumulated but constantly and systemically reproduced to continue to exist. Marx's conception of capital goes beyond the economist reductionism of his time. He not only recognizes the convertibility of capital to its various social forms but also highlights the role of unequal social power. This power is exercised through the power of ownership, such as private property, decision-making processes, and institutions. Marx brings to the analytical foreground the realities of social conflicts and power structures embedded in such processes and institutions of capital accumulation. In doing so, he reveals the actual unequal social relations of power beneath the apparently apolitical mechanical and economistic representation of the economy by bourgeois political economists. According to recent interpretations of Marx made possible through the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe project, value for Marx is not just a substance in things but also, or some may say, rather, a socially necessary standard arbitrated through the process of the evaluation of things. It is thus a relational quality. See Elson, 1979. Heinrich, 2021. Pitts, 2021. But under the social relations created by capital, much or most of the value created by this social product, and the social surplus, is privately appropriated and accumulated, ostensibly to produce yet further wealth in the future. On a world scale, this constitutes processes of the expanded reproduction of capital into all spheres of life, encountering and eventually assimilating all other modes of social existence into itself. The expansion of capital, therefore, entails the annihilation of any other form of social existence. Marx's insight can be applied more broadly, suggesting that all historical social systems, whether capitalist or non-capitalist, can be understood in terms of how they produce, expropriate, redistribute, and struggle over the social surplus. However, the notion of surplus here implies that the value produced by the communities and individuals when they are, ideally, free from subordination is the same as the value that the capitalist ruling class defines in practice, only differing in the magnitudes of what is being produced and appropriated above the level needed for the reproduction of labor power. Of course, according to Marx in Capital, what associations of free and equal producers value for themselves is the use value made by concrete labor, while the capitalist harvests the abstract economic exchange value that emerges from abstract labor. However, the word surplus fails to reflect the conversion of potentialities for generating true value into actualities used to construct fetish value, which is then fictitiously perceived as true value. This is not just an excess in magnitude, it is, first and foremost, a mutation in the essence of value. Exploitation can continue to exist in much subtler ways, even in the absence of surplus, merely by virtue of this conversion, or better to say, a perversion. For instance, automation reduces the socially necessary labor time, and thereby potentially the capitalist surplus value, while the perversion of true value to fetish value, and thus, its annihilation rate, exponentially increases. Capital, as a form of social relations and relationship with labor, land, and natural resources, is inherently antagonistic to oikos, a non-capitalist care-based mode of creativity. In the historical encounter between ever-expansionist capital and oikos, each representing two essentially different modes of value construction, the historical tendency is that capital annihilates oikos. These two forms of social relations and social modes of existence cannot coexist peacefully. Why should we believe that an attempt to define oikos as a source with real potentialities for generating true value is more idealistic than the analyses of the capitalist mode of commodity value production in its ideal average? Both approaches, the primarily normative and the primarily analytical, when left unrelated, involve a degree of idealization or abstraction from the messy realities of socio-ecological systems of livelihood, whether by assuming the existence of a perfect market in the case of capitalism or the existence of a utopian commonwealth in the case of oikos. Economic growth is both intrinsic and essential to capital's socio-historical role and is conventionally assumed to be linear and unlimited. See Meadows and Club of Rome, 1972, Meadows et al., 2004. Despite the fast-growing rate of the annihilation of the remaining ecological sources of value, capital as fetish value in motion and operation has been exponentially growing in magnitude. True value, upon which both human and non-human lives depend, holds a greater inherent reality, despite its normative status within our theory, than the realized fetish value under capital. This is because, without true value, organized life itself would cease to exist, rendering any extraction of value impossible. The four major limitations. The traditional Marxist conception of capital suffers from four major limitations when applied to the complex socio-ecological mechanisms and processes through which capital sustains itself, deals with its crises, and interacts with the discontented social forces that it inevitably generates. These limitations are largely rooted in the works of Marx himself and are understandable considering Marx's intentional adoption of the limited scope to critique within and beyond the mainstream political economy of his time. Another reason behind the persistence of these limitations to this day, within and outside the orthodoxy, is the tendency among many of the followers of Marx, and by extension, his critics, to view any systemic reconstruction of his value theory to understand capitalist society as a violation of his method. Interestingly, each one of the limitations is closely related to one of the four irreducible sources of true value, as briefly introduced in the previous chapter, which, except in the case of labor, are pushed to the background whilst being seen at best as only sources of use value or the conditions of possibility for the economic exploitation of labor. Capital, however, is open to reconstruction by leaving the doors open for reinventing the notion of value while maintaining Marx's metaphysical approach, in some places, by briefly acknowledging sources and determinants of value other than labor, and in other places, by implying the necessity of notional extensions. These potentialities remain unfulfilled as capital's value theory focuses on the inner structure rather than the entirety of capitalist society. Despite successfully showing the sociality of capital, the hypothetical dualism of the inner versus the outer remains problematic when we aim to develop a panoramic social theory of capitalist society beyond the sole perspective provided via political economy. In brief, the principal limitations are accounted for as follows. First, regarding the sphere of creativity, the Marxian concept of capital is, by and large, centered around production relations. This limitation is due to the centrality of productive labor in Marxian value theory, understood as the only ultimate source of added capitalist value. Feminist critics, both Marxist revisionists and post-Marxists, have long argued for the incorporation of not only reproductive labor and effective work but also the body into the definition of value. Moreover, capital extracts massive amounts of surplus value in setups other than in industrial, productive and monetized ones, which have profound impacts on production and the real economy. These extra-productive forms of expropriation that, in a sense, are incredibly old, antediluvian, cannot simply be considered secondary to exploitative labor-capital relations. The rising power of global, rentier and casino capitalist classes to appropriate astronomical amounts of wealth is a pattern that has already required many theorists to broaden their definitions of capital beyond production relations and exploitation of labor power. In the aftermath of the GFC, one of the critiques that emerged from elite figures within the financial system itself was that much of contemporary finance lacked any social utility. Capital can capitalize on social commons and even more abstract commons like the future life, using financial and credit devices. It also capitalizes on the miseries of alienated selves, by fabricating various meanings of life and a false sense of agency and choice, a quality that makes capital far more resilient than may have been expected from within the Marxist tradition. Capital can create artificial commons, such as virtual, digital spaces where the creative work of users in the form of free information and knowledge can be harvested, i.e., a contemporary euphemism for expropriated. Subsequent to our present discussion, it becomes apparent that the mere act of broadening the definition of value to encompass the so-called unproductive sources of value is insufficient. Furthermore, it would be misguided to assume that all such sources affect value in an identical fashion. Rather, a more pressing exigency is to elaborate a theoretical framework that elucidates the interrelationship between value as formulated under and beyond the capitalist mode of production and develop a typology of causal sources that contribute to its generation. Second, regarding the sphere of livability, Marx differentiated analytically between use value and exchange value, and developed the concept of metabolic rift to highlight the contradictory relationship between society and nature under capitalism. However, how his theory of value can be reconstructed to adequately reflect the ecological dynamics and dimensions of capitalist processes remains highly debated. Consult Foster and Burkett, 2016. Moore, 2017b. Saito, 2017a. Foster and Clark, 2020. In the historically specific bourgeois economy and its sciences, those spheres that cannot be converted to financial value are often perceived as lacking value, agency, and sociality. Nature, reproductive labor, public knowledge, and social-political institutions are all perverted into the material causes of use value in the process of producing exchange value. Marx's Capital analyzes such a system, refer to Fraser, 2014. However, Marx acknowledges the foundational role that nature plays in value production, in addition to labor, the necessities of labor's social reproduction, and the consequences of constant class struggles, socially produced knowledge, and technology as factors that determine how much surplus value can be extracted. Once again, this limitation can be traced back to the dualism of nature versus labor, and the treatment of nature by capital as a mere background condition for the possibility of value, rather than a direct source of value. Simply expanding the notion of capitalist value to include nature will not be helpful if our definition of value remains confined by capitalist relations. Nature is only deprived of agency and meaning when it is isolated from human society in a dualistic mode of thinking. However, when seen as an active commons of life, deeply interconnected with human creativity, care, and conviviality, it becomes an active source of true value, when constantly interacting with its own human component in a socio-ecological commons form. Therefore, a normative analytical theory of value should focus on the perversion of this true value to fetish value form under capital. More recently, significant efforts have been made to identify the role of nature in Marx's thought and to highlight ecological analysis in the classical Marxist tradition and revisionist world system theory of capital. See also Foster et al. 2010. Moore, 2015. Foster and Burkett, 2016. Moore, 2017b, 2017a, 2018. Foster and Clark, 2020. However, even with such advancements, apart from the disagreements among them, an integrative theory of value and, thereby, of capital, has not been fully developed. An integrative theory of value under capital and value beyond capital is expected to help us develop non-reductionist explanations of the contradictory capitalist expansions despite, and through, ecological crises. Third, with respect to the sphere of conviviality, although the Marxian concept of capital highlights the hierarchical social relations that underpin production relations, it often struggles to adequately incorporate a range of inequalities other than exploitative class relations unless considering them secondary to class relations in the final analysis. This has significant implications for theorizing the aspects of social life where non-capitalist power relations remain central. Traditional Marxist attempts to theorize the state, for instance, are closely related to their class theory, which is a strength in itself but inadequate insofar as it falls short of incorporating other forms of subjugation and resistance. However, they are not clearly related to their value theory, where the state is simply seen as an epiphenomenon of capitalist relations with a role to play concerning the contradictions of the movement of fetish value. Marx promised but never achieved his formulation of a value theory of the state. As arguably still the most powerful form of social domination and control, and increasingly analyzed as tightly bound up with and acting instrumentally on behalf of the interests of capital, the current forms of state power continue to exercise new colonialist, imperialist relations both at the domestic and international levels. Indeed, vast portions of humanity, as well as myriad non-human species, may be understood to be suffering under the exploitation and oppression of the capitalist-state nexus, and not just via capital directly in the capital-labor relation of exploitation. Post-Marxian theories that attempt to address this limitation either do not engage with value theory or conflate the capitalist value derived from labor with the intrinsic value embedded in the socially reproductive relations spanning from households to the state. Power emerges in different forms and has different faces and does not solely depend on the possession, ownership, of material resources. It is not always planned, nor merely exercised unwittingly. It is not always formed against a resisting force, as it can sometimes avoid resistance through manufacturing consent, co-opting the descent, or manipulating satisfaction and affection. Therefore, power can be manipulative, exploitative, extractivist, domineering, Mead, or most of the time, a combination of the four. See Shariati, 1976, Ranima, 2008, Bird, 2019. To coherently theorize the complex reality of power relations, we need to reconsider the traditional assumption that human creative power is the only active source of true value. Human sociability, inclusive of relationships with non-human beings, in the ideal state of self-sustaining autonomy and just associations, or what we know as conviviality, is another causal source of true value. Conscientious cooperation, as one of the essential qualities of conviviality, having evolved to significantly more sophisticated levels and thus being capable of enhancing collective more than human well-living, despite tensions, contests, and contrasts, produces true value. It is through the decommunization of this socio-historical commons that the coloniality of capital is realized. Fourth, concerning the sphere of alterity, the Marxian theory of capital was originally developed to explicate how capital sustains and reproduces itself, along with the resulting implications for both the system and society. It, therefore, focuses primarily on the task of understanding the existing order in the most objective way possible, yet still putative in some important respects. A dialectical mode of thinking, however, requires us to recognize the reality of lost capacities, denied opportunities, and suppressed agencies, as well as co-opted decencies in the conflicts historically necessary for the survival of capital, without which the existing order could not be sustained. Above all are the capacities and forms of knowledge and practices that, when realized, could liberate us and the planet from the detrimental forces of alienated nature, history, society, and self. These fundamental sources of what we call alterity, therefore, remain largely under-theorized in the Marxian theory of value. No theory is constructed to show what role these sources of alterity, such as human collective prefigurative actions, can play in the production of forms of value that are incommensurable with value under capital. Marx, in the process of outlining his theory of value, sporadically refers to non-capitalist modes of production and distribution, such as actually existing primitive forms of communism and imagined post-capitalist ones. However, these references are primarily used to expound the specificities of capitalist inner workings. What is more important is an integrated theory that reveals the complex yet critical relationships between the commoning sources of true value and the decommunizing mechanisms of fetish value. An alternative theory should explain how capital distorts and prevents the mechanisms of the production of true value from functioning as transmutative projects. It should also analyze how capital harnesses its energies by ultimately incorporating them into the production of fetish value, and what capacities exist for true value to historically overcome fetish value. Social striving to realize post-capitalist alternatives draws on humans' prefigurative power as another causal source of true value. These need to be integrated into our understanding of capital, since the actuality and consequences of their denial are as real as the reality of capital and its actual ramifications for quality of life. Che Guevara's maxim, "Be realistic, demand the impossible," denotes the cruel reality of denied possibilities, the impossible, in a context where the imposed, induced possible, is impractical and detrimental, indeed, destructive, for the oppressed common. When we see the source of value as the cause of value, the limitations outlined above can be dealt with by radically reconstructing Marx's value theory of capital. However, there are important capacities nascently developed in capital that can be employed on the way and further extended explicitly in dialogue with more recent theoretical developments to construct a more useful contemporary analytical framework. Even if it is an initial step, Marx's Capital and Grundrisse represent a significant move toward understanding capital's inner logic, dynamics, forms, flaws, failures, and futures. There are potentialities in his work that have not been fully recognized, even by himself, due to the historical specificities of the 19th century capitalist relations and the insufficiency and constraints of old conceptual language that influenced Marx and many who followed him. Although many Marxist and post-Marxist thinkers have made highly important progress in further addressing the complexities of capital in later decades right up until today, integrative efforts across these new developments to overcome the avoidable chasms in the tradition have remained insignificant. The four limitations above are rooted in the underlying perception of value and its sources. there is a significant difference between conceptualizing value as it is actualized through the mechanisms of sustaining the prevailing power structure and defining it independent of the parameters of the reigning order in its normative form. The former may only be useful enough to display inherent contradictions of what we have hypothetically isolated as the ideal average of the status quo, whereas the latter can widen the scope of the project large enough to liberate our perception of capital, including the one in capital, from its self-imposed constraints, thus paving the way for incorporating other causal sources of value. However, the latter cannot be the basis for a theory that aims to be critically analytical of how the former is attained. The two must complement one another in an integrative theory. The former notion of value has been adopted by the Marxian tradition, as well as its revisionists and critics, which we complement with the concept of fetish value, the value that is not only the result of but also results in damaging the more than human capacities to generate true value. This definition is crucial to make possible the synthesis between the original Marxian value theory and critical theories disappointed with its narrowness. The communist approach we advocate will be based on differentiating between fetish value, capitalist value, commodity value, and true value. It does not require the negation of Marx or Marxian theory of value, since it still includes its notion of value to be complemented with fetish value relative to true value and to be located in broader realms of more than human creativity, liveability, conviviality, and alterity. Fetish value is inclusive of but not limited to the abstract economic, exchange, value of commodities. It is broad enough to include relations outside the capitalist mode of production itself. Fetish value is thus understood as a quality attributed to the results of any decommoning activity under capital, which is socially fetishized to appear to have an intrinsic value for the well-being of the individuals and collectives involved. It thus functions against their true value. True value, on the other hand, is any quality definitive and advantageous for the survival, self-fulfillments, and liberation of more than human organized life if and only if 1. It is decided and realized in the most consensual, context-specific, collaborative way possible, consensual feature, and 2. It challenges the mechanisms of the construction of fetish value to their core, defetishizing feature. The latter condition is essential to avoid the widespread delusion that any activity beneficial to the material and psychological survival of the human community that happens in conjunction or symbiotic relationships with capital would be intrinsically transformative. This differentiates between non-transformative and transformative true value. The word source of value is widely used in both classical political economy and Marxian literature. However, despite being the subject of great controversy as to what should be seen as the source of value, surprisingly, extremely limited reflections have been made on what the term source here really means. A source of a thing, by definition, is its point of origin or procurement, or the generative force behind it. See End Note 8. Therefore, the source of an object maintains an existential causal relationship with it, implying that the existence of the object is contingent upon its source in the causal process through which the object emerges from its source. This is different from other types of causalities, commonly referred to in mainstream social sciences, which relate already existing events, entities through probabilistic or constant conjunctions. The existential causation of an object is the most irreducible type of causality, through which the effects emerge out of causes through a transformative process. This way of conceptualizing source invites us to consider the application of the Aristotelian doctrine of four irreducible types of existential causation, i.e., the efficient, the material, the formal, and the final. Therefore, the four causal sources of true value can be classified as follows. 1. The commoning sources of creativity as the efficient cause of true value comprise, more than, humans' capacities to achieve self-sustaining levels of collective well-living conscientiously and creatively in a balanced coexistence with the rest of the life domain. These sources include humans' creative power to produce and regenerate material goods and services and to socially reproduce their own power, but also to creatively engage in leisure, play, love, and works of aesthetic, spiritual, introspective, and amusing value. 2. The commoning sources of livability as the material cause of true value that are the physical and intangible resources necessary for a good life. These resources are reproduced through restorative and regenerative practices that are shared and decided upon collectively by communities of organisms. The more than human world is a living organism beset with energy, agency, feeling, and meaning, and thus constantly generates true value. 3. the commoning sources of conviviality as the formal cause of true value that are the capacity of more than human populations to develop harmonious ways of living well together, well-living, self-love, care, and care for the other, as well as their relative autonomy and deep interdependence, pluriversality of their life worlds, and their communal solidarity. True value is the blood of communal relationships, flowing from one commons to another and back again. In the communist state of living, any value extracted is mutually compensated with value injected so the commons and the relationships between them would persist. And finally, 4. The commoning sources of alterity is the final cause of true value, such as organized prefigurative practices and subjectivities, imaginative, symbolic, proactivist, are essential for transcending the dominant hierarchical structures and for realizing rightful ideals and dreams and human liberation from alienating structures. Such practices are organized in ways other than, and in the categorical negation of, the capitalist, colonialist, and modernist modes of living. Any emancipatory knowledge associated with such practices, when co-created in a commons form, contributes to this final cause. The final cause is a potentiality that actualizes itself by encoding its logic into the other three fundamental causes. In a capitalist social formation, the real end of value production is the perpetuation of capital, and thus, of capital's social power. The process of value production under capital is therefore a closed circuit and a vicious cycle. Capital, as the final cause of fetish value production, actualizes its potentiality by bringing about a transformation in the very essence of labor, nature, and community, enabling their incorporation into its machines and rendering them the means for the social reproduction of capital. Capital does not tolerate alterity. In our view, alterity is the capacity to break the closed circuit of the reproduction of fetish value. If existential liberation is what true value is ultimately for, and if to be free is to be able to surpass the given world toward an open future, see Beauvoir, 2015, page 97, then alterity is the ultimate purpose, existential liberation, in its potential, virtual form, active throughout the production of true value and the unraveling of fetish value. The bearers of this final cause of true value are prefigurative sociopolitical actions that counter the hegemonic power, structure and organization, of capital. By embracing alterity, individuals and communities strive to break free from oppressive systems, dismantle hierarchical structures, and foster inclusive relationships based on equality, justice, and respect. It involves recognizing the need for change, valuing diverse contributions, and actively working toward creating a more inclusive and empowering society. The final cause differs essentially from the other three, Aristotelian, types of causality. The final cause of a thing underpins, emerges, transcends out of, and influences, the other fundamental causes of it. Final causes underpin the other three types of causes by implanting their logic in them and reshaping them so that the end would self-realize. Since causality is a transitional process, the efficient, the material, and the formal need to be re-coded from the onset to become the means to the end. See End Note 9. Under the communist state of alterity, true value differs essentially from fetish value by being an open-ended end, an indeterminate final cause, to be constantly defined and redefined, made and remade. This is because the ability to prefigure, deliberate, define, and realize it in the most creative, convivial, autonomous, and ecologically livable ways possible is itself part of the value. In contrast, under capital, value is determined by the existence of capital itself, with capital being regarded as the ultimate value. Capital thus imposes itself as a closed-ended final cause, one that imposes its fixed logic on the way social ecological relations are organized. This requires capital to take away socio-ecological agency from the more than human potential producers of true value. Marx took important steps toward freeing our understanding of capital from the bourgeois mindset embedded in the orthodox economics of his predecessors. However, as the above limitations imply, the orthodox Marxian conceptions of capital, in some important ways, remain captive to a positivistic conviction where capitalist relations are normalized in the absence of a normative perception of value. Transformative movements thus need to liberate their understanding of value from using such persisting conceptual residues as a base for defining capital and capitalism. Surely, it is not adequate to only develop a taxonomy of the irreducible sources of value. A value theory of capital and capitalist societies needs to be based on a framework that helps us explore the systematic interrelations between the four modes of causality, see Figure 2.1. the common essence that underpins all four sources, thus making them the origin of true value, is nothing but their commoning nature. However, what makes them different yet complementary is their differences regarding the type of causality they bear. True value, to be generated, needs each of the four types of causation to work at the same time. The four fundamental commoning sources of true value are deeply intertwined and interdependent by virtue of their common nature and their complementary differences. The full transformation of each into capital is not possible without transforming the others, and the meaningful, sustainable liberation of one is not possible without liberating the others. Marx's Capital shows some important capacities within its limited scope of focusing on the inner structure of capital and seeing how labor loses its role as an active cause, etios, meaning agent, of value under productive capital. Marx acknowledges the role of several determining factors, ation, other than labor, despite factoring them out in his final analysis of commodity value. See Chapter 5 for more discussion. For instance, abstract economic, exchange, value cannot become known unless commodities are exchanged in the market, and this opens the door for other social factors and non-production relations mediated by money to play a role. Factors like the subjective preferences of final consumers when defining the utility of commodities, purchasing power of workers and their families, more broadly, aggregate demand, technological advancements and automation, natural resource scarcity, and the metabolic rifts and damages to the environment. And sociopolitical struggles and conflicts, especially between working classes and capitalist classes over wages and working hours, etc. Figure 2.1 in the book shows the interdependence of the four fundamental commoning causes of true value. As a closing remark, reducing the complex social and ecological causes of value to merely economic factors is an ontological reduction with practical consequences. When translated into policy or practice, it reduces socio-ecological relations to reified material exchanges between humans and strips labor and social life of any non-material, post-human, meaning, and emancipatory potential. Endnotes on Chapter 2. Note 1. This chapter draws on material from the paper titled Capital as Fetish Value, Has No True Value, by Hosseini, 2022. Note 2. Since the mid-20th century, a growing number of scholars from both the Marxist and non-Marxist camps have increasingly criticized and contested the value theory, citing its limitations and uncertainties. Note 3. Although Jason W. Moore's approach represents a departure from the norm, it is not without its own set of issues. In Chapter 6, we will examine these problems more closely. See also Foster and Burkett, 2018. Note 4. Such an inquiry would require a dialogue between the immanent ontology of normativity, those values embedded in the historicity of struggles, and the transcendental argumentations, as promoted through meta-ideological and meta-faith systems of thought, instead of negating one in favor of the other. Note 5. In both Grundrisse and Capital, Marx uses the term real value only as a catchphrase to refer to the exchange value of commodities different to their nominal or price or money value. 1993, page 137. Note 6. Marx defines real wealth as the developed productive power of all individuals. 1993, page 708. Real wealth for him is the result of social cooperation and the development of technology and productive forces and is a measure of the productive capacity of society as a whole. Note 7. In contrast to the term real value, the term true value suggests a broader perspective that goes beyond reducing the issue to usefulness or productive capacity. This aligns more closely with our perspective of dialectical critical realism, which we adopted in this book. See Chapter 3 on critical realism can help us reconstruct Marx's value theory. Critical realism asserts that there is a mind-independent reality that exists beyond human perception, but it is in a dialectical relationship with it. Marx's approach does not reject the existence of a mind-independent reality, but rather, critiques the way in which capitalism distorts and obscures this reality. Thus, Marx's approach can be seen as a form of critical realism that seeks to uncover the underlying reality often obscured by ideology and power structures. Note 8. See Merriam-Webster Dictionary, online at. Note 9. Aristotle described the causal equation as the progression from actual to potential, from the purity of actual desire to the modifications necessary for the realization in the potential. Levine, 2021, page 137.